Welcome to the Emergency and Alerts video tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to explain to you how to use the emergency features so you can trigger events outside of the Signage Studio, for example from a web interface, and have these events propagate throughout your Signage screens. So for example, universities would integrate their existing emergency system with the digital signage. So if, let's say, for example, there's a fire, all the screens or the specified screens could actually go ahead and display a particular message, for example, evacuate the building, with an arrow to the exit signs. And so in this video tutorial, we'll explain how to configure and trigger these type of events. So before we begin, let's go ahead and just summarize really quick what we're going to talk about. So we'll start by first creating a simple user underneath an enterprise account. This user will only have the privileges to be able to trigger these type of events. Next, I'll show you how to configure the campaign with events so you can select particular timelines for particular events. And also we're going to touch on JavaScript, how to configure the web interface using JavaScript or jQuery so you can actually execute these events from the web interface. This is really cool because if, for example, you wanted to trigger these events from mobile device, you could do that. So you don't necessarily have to be in front of a computer to be able to trigger these emergency and alert events. Also, through the help of JavaScript, you'll be able to send events to a particular screen, to multicast or multiple screens, or you'll be able to send events to all your screens. And we're also going to touch on the topic of web services, where you can actually trigger not just an event within our system, but actually send a command to a remote system through a web interface or through an HTTP call. And to summarize the capabilities of the emergency feature, you can initiate on your tablet or mobile device through very simple JavaScript commands an emergency alert, and this event will propagate through the internet to the selected screens and show the selected timeline that you've configured. Now, if you own a private server, this could all be done within your infrastructure as well. In addition to that, you can also call a web service. So for example, if you have an existing alerting system, this web service can notify the alerting system so it can turn on the siren or whatever that alerting system does. And because we support programmatic triggering, you don't necessarily have to trigger it yourself through a mobile device. You can actually have your existing alerting system do the triggering and have your timelines changed with the appropriate message. So I went ahead and logged into my enterprise account, and you can see that I have here an account called Demo Business, and it has a single user called Demo Biz. And so this user has all the privileges. It's kind of like an admin account that can do anything within the system. However, we are also going to want to set up an account with very, very limited privileges. We're going to set up an account that actually only has one set of privileges, which is going to be to send stations commands. And before we do that, let's go ahead and switch to privileges and go to campaigns and make sure that our default privileges also are set up with campaign events. So we want to go ahead and make sure we enable that, and we'll go ahead and save our work. And so again, DemoBiz has the privileges which can do everything including the event system. Next, we'll set up our very limited user. So we'll go ahead and click on the plus sign. We'll call this user just alert. And we'll go ahead and give it a password of 123, 123. And click on OK. And you can see that by default, this user has all the privileges. So that's actually not what we want. So we'll go back to privileges and go ahead and set up a new set of privileges. And go ahead and call this limited. And in this case, we're actually going to remove all the checkbox. So this particular user, or any user for that matter, that has the limited privileges will not be able to really do anything in the system. But if we go over here under stations, under advanced, we are going to give the limited privilege set the ability to send commands. So that's the only thing that the limited privilege set can do. And again, go ahead and save the work. Switch back to our users, and now switch our alert user to have limited privileges, and again save our work. Now the reason why we want to have a user with such limited privileges is that in our particular case, in our demo, we're going to create a JavaScript app that's going to reside on the web, and anybody is going to really be able to view the username and password. Now, of course, in an alerting system, this particular web page will be within a website that nobody has access to. You can, for example, protect the page with the username and password. You can even run this particular HTML page on your local desktop, or you can run it on a private server. So we don't necessarily have to create a limited user, but for our case, we believe it's just going to be another layer of security to create a user with very limited privileges, because that's really all that this user is going to need to do, just to send commands. But again, it's up to you however way you want to set it up. And again, if you have a private server within your local infrastructure, you don't necessarily have to follow the same pattern. So that pretty much completes the user configuration. Now let's go ahead and launch the studio as the admin, as the person that has the full privileges. And next we'll go ahead and create a new campaign. This is going to be just our demo campaign. Click on next. Select our screen setup. And here we just have a regular standard campaign, nothing special about it. However, we're going to go ahead and add another timeline. And in this case, we'll go ahead and call this our timeline 1. And we'll go ahead and add 2 more timelines. Our second timeline we're going to call it earthquake and do a full screen. And the third timeline, go ahead and call this fire. Do a full screen. So we have our regular standard timeline that's going to play back when everything is good and everything is calm. But in case of an emergency, we'll be able to switch into an earthquake or into a fire timeline. Now, in order to save time, I went ahead and skipped a little bit forward and just filled the presentations with content. So our first timeline has a very simple presentation with a food menu board and some RSS. Our second timeline actually has an emergency, and this will be our earthquake. And you can see right here there's an arrow pointing to the door. It says watch out for falling debris. And then we have our fire. Going to click on play, and again just a full screen message with an error. Next, we'll actually select the demo campaign by clicking on it to load up its properties. And over here under events, we'll go ahead and select it. And again, remember that we've enabled earlier through privileges the events module, and so that's why we see this tab right here. And we'll go ahead and switch over here to events, to this accordion tab on the bottom, and click on the plus sign to add a new event. Here I'll create my first event, and you can give it any name. I'm just going to call this my fire event, and select a timeline. So in this case, we're going to select a particular timeline. We'll go ahead and make a little bit more room here, and we're going to go ahead and select our fire timeline. Add another event called our earthquake, and again select our earthquake timeline. And for the resume, we're going to actually set up a manual resume, meaning that this timeline is going to continue indefinitely until we resume it back to our normal playback. So we'll set manual resume on both. So they're just going to stay like this forever until we switch it back to our normal timeline 1. Next, we'll go ahead and add one more event. And this will be our normal, since it's going to go back to normal playback whenever we trigger this event. And over here, we're going to select resume presentation. So this will actually force the presentation back to your normal sequencer. Speaking of sequencer, now that we've set up our 3 events, let's go to our sequences. And this is a really important step. You want to make sure that you take out the earthquake and the fire timelines, since under normal playback, you actually don't want to play these timelines. You just want to play these timelines in case of an event or an emergency. Now let's go back to our timelines, go back to our events, and just confirm that everything is set up just the way that you like. Let me just make a side note that these events right here could really be any string. I just picked here fire and earthquake, which are identical to our timelines, but over here for normal, I picked a different string that doesn't really match timeline 1. So these events could really be anything you want, and I'll show you later how to actually associate these strings with the actual trigger of the event. Next, we'll go ahead and add one more event. Now for the last event, what I'd like to do is, in case of a fire, and only in case of a fire, I would like to call the fire department. And so what I'm going to do over here under the select command to post to a URL. And then I can paste in whatever URL that I'd like. So I'll just go ahead and paste in a URL. And in this case, I'll just put my domain / call 911. Now, of course, you'll have to go and develop your own script that does whatever you want. If you have an existing alerting system, a lot of time alerting systems can receive API calls, and so again, you can use your web service to connect through the API of the alert system and turn on sirens or whatever it is that your alerting system supports. But by using the event system, you're actually, in case of a fire, you're going to trigger two events. These two events right here, the fire and the fire here. So it's going to change the timeline to fire and at the same time post a URL and basically call 911 or do whatever it is that you'd like to do. And you can keep on adding as many events as you want, and when you trigger a particular string, all of the matched events will execute. So we've done everything that we needed as far as the studio configuration, and as you can see, our player is running. So next, let's go ahead and use the JavaScript or the browser side to actually control the presentation or control the events using JavaScript. We'll go ahead and open our editor, and right here in the editor you can see we have some JavaScript, really simple, nothing fancy. Let me make a little bit more room here so we can see more of it. So we can basically see that we have three buttons right here: button 1, 2, and 3. Button 1 is a fire, button 2 is earthquake, and button 3 is our resume. And you can actually download the source code from our website to the link that I'm going to post right here. And really the most important part of the page is right here, the include script. This is actually the source code of the library, so you just need to make sure you include the library so you can actually take advantage of the remote commands or the remote events. So now that we've defined our three buttons, we basically have three functions, and each function will simply send a command. And you can see right here that we have the server address, and if you're not using a private server, you're using our cloud, you'll just put galaxy.sonage.me if you're using our media cloud solution, regardless if it's enterprise or free. Then you'll actually use the username. Remember, we created a very limited user with the username of alert, and then we gave it a password of 123 that user that only has the send command privileges. So you'll simply put the username and the password, and you'll actually need to put right here the event. So the first button will be the fire, and we'll just simply paste in the fire event that we've picked in the studio. Then the earthquake, which is again just a string that we've picked in the studio, and then the normal to go back to normal playback. Now, one more thing I'd like you to pay attention to is actually the fourth argument, which in our case right here is -1. Now, -1 means broadcast, or in other words, go ahead and send this command, send this event fire to every single station, to every single screen in my network. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because if you've set up a campaign and that campaign is not listening for events, or even if it is listening for events, but it's not listening for specifically a string with the fire event, nothing is going to happen. So that particular station running that particular campaign is not going to get affected. So -1 is not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you actually are going to disturb the whole entire network if you're sending a broadcast. In most cases, you only are going to set specific stations with the event system, and so the -1 will affect only those stations that are running specific campaigns that were configured with events that are listening to the fire string. However, sometimes you would actually like to target specific stations. And let me give you an example. If I go back to our campaign, you'll notice that I put an arrow right here under the fire sign, meaning that people are going to walk to a specific direction for the exit. Now, obviously, if you have many screens that are configured and are scattered around your building, you'll have arrows in different directions and may give different messages. Maybe in some areas you'd like them to take the stairs, in some areas you'd like them to take the fire escape. And so you'll need to configure each station maybe a little bit differently. So what you can do is, going back to our JavaScript file, you can target specific stations. So instead of putting -1, and I can actually put a station ID. So again, I'll go back to the Sonage Studio, and I'll go back to stations. And over here under stations, if you scroll to the last column, you'll notice there's a station ID. And the station ID is basically a unique identifier of that particular screen or that particular station that's running right now. You see it's green and it's working. And in fact, if we do a live snapshot, you can see that it's not running our emergency right now. It's just running normal playback. So again, the ID for this particular station is 43. And so what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to go ahead and target station 43 for the fire. So In case of a fire, we're not going to target the entire network, we only are going to target station 43. Now, what you can do, for example, is you can copy and paste this line and you can target specific machines. You can say that in case of a fire, I'd like to go ahead and target specific machines, 3 particular computers or signage players. But however, if there is, for example, an earthquake, I want to go ahead and target all the players. So you can go -1, which is everyone. So you can see it's very flexible. So let's go and save our work and go ahead and minimize the file right here and minimize this. And again, we're looking at the player. And you can see that our player is working fine and everything's great. Now I'll go ahead and bring over here the player. I'll bring my HTML page, and again, this could be inside a mobile device or an iPad or really anywhere you want. Could be within the intranet or internet, completely up to you. And I'll go and click on the fire. And you'll notice as soon as I click on fire, the presentation changed into fire. And this will continue indefinitely because that's the way we've set it up in the signage studio. Now I'll go ahead and switch back to resume. So now again, normal playback, and go ahead and switch into earthquake. Now I really hope we don't have a fire and earthquake at the same time, but if we do, we are prepared. And go back to resume. So you can see it's very simple and gives you really a nice way to switch between different timelines. Now it took us so long to configure everything, I figured I'll go ahead and play with it a little bit. Okay, that's enough. Couple of quick last notes. If you didn't want to run this through JavaScript but actually wanted to run this through a backend like PHP or C#, that's very simple. Just look at our source code right here and you can simply convert the JS to a PHP to backend. So again, very simple to do and more secure. So that's something that you can definitely do. Another thing is, remember that when you configure this, anytime I switch it to fire, we actually are going to post to a URL, a second event. Well, take my word for it, it is working. I'm actually looking at some traces here. So the post to URL is working as well. And so that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial, and thanks for watching.